Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today we are talking about the National Security Agency, or NSA, because they want big tech to build backdoors into their platforms for them. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen government agencies ask for this kind of thing, but it is the first time that I can think of that the NSA has, and here's what's going on. And interestingly enough, this is coming from Popular Mechanics, although this is actually some really good reporting. Now, the NSA has reportedly ducked questions recently about similar requests for special access into enterprise-level software, and last fall, Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, who serves on the Senate Intel Committee, told Reuters that the government, and I quote, shouldn't have any role in planting secret backdoors in encryption technology used by Americans. But unfortunately, not all of the government is listening to Senator Wyden. Now, proponents, I should say, for this technology say that backdoors are useful for intelligence investigations, like intercepting communications within terrorist organizations. However, critics, such as myself, say that this kind of access can lead to problematic data collection practices, like looking through large amounts of data without a warrant. Plus, backdoors could compromise domestic tech to basically espionage, which is already a major fear with things like Chinese developed software in the United States that companies might be adopting or using. Now, as it turns out, the United States, though, isn't alone in requesting that tech companies build software backdoors into their products for them. Last year, both Japan and India, plus member nations within the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Alliance, including the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UK, signed a public letter calling on tech companies to implement backdoors that would help law enforcement to gain access to encrypted data. Now, in this letter, this group of countries, these 7 countries, say that encryption technology, and I quote, plays a crucial role in protecting personal data, privacy, intellectual property, trade secrets, and cybersecurity. But there are quote-unquote particular implementations of encryption tech that preclude law enforcement access, which can in turn threaten public safety and vulnerable populations like exploited children. And that is an argument I have heard for quite some time. Please think about the children in this case. And obviously nobody wants to see a child exploited in any which way, shape, or form. But here we are talking about this. Now, specifically, these 7 countries are calling for, number 1, system designs that can facilitate government investigations. Number 2, access to quote-unquote readable and usable content from such systems, in cases where law enforcement is authorized, meaning if they've got a warrant, they should easily be able to get that. And number 3, engagement between tech companies, governments, and other stakeholders, so design choices can be made in such a way that this access can be granted at basically on demand. Now, tech companies say that backdoors are flying in the face of the end-to-end encryption, essentially making that privacy framework null and void, which is true. If something is not end-to-end encrypted, then somebody else is getting access to it. In a full end-to-end encryption, like think of the Signal app, for example, that is end-to-end encrypted, nobody can intercept or read that unless you're able to decrypt the information. So obviously very secure, but problematic for law enforcement. Now, while we're talking about the United States here and the government's call to do this, remember the FBI and the DOJ have been asking for this for years, now the NSA, we can look at China, though, to see where this can go with government essentially dictating to big tech. And so as an example, Huawei, which is a massive Chinese tech manufacturer known for obviously its smartphones and also its telecommunications equipment, can reportedly gain access into cell phone network infrastructure that it helped to build and implement. Namely, this is basically through software backdoors intended for government use by the Beijing government. And this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal. This could allow Huawei to access sensitive information through base stations, antennas, and switching gear, which is obviously a national security nightmare for any country that is implementing this. If you recall, the United States banned Huawei from deploying their 5G infrastructure here in the United States, meaning Verizon, Sprint, AT&T, etc. could not purchase Huawei and use Huawei equipment as they were building that 5G infrastructure out here in the United States. Now, naturally, Huawei is not a fan of this characterization, and they've essentially called out the author of that Wall Street Journal report, Bojan Penchnevisky, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, and the U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien as well, as participating in an ongoing campaign to discredit Huawei. But here's the thing. if you are designing something and if you are developing something, you can put a backdoor into that. But overall, as we are talking about this, one of the biggest problems that we have, and yes, there are going to be criminals out there that are going to use, essentially technology against law enforcement by leveraging things like end-to-end encryption. But the problem that we have, though, is that there are many platforms out there. So we know that Facebook is data mined heavily, and if anybody wants to get into Facebook, like the NSA, that's going to be really easy. Also, Facebook basically honors warrants. I literally just did a video on this where there were gag orders in place, where major companies like Apple were essentially giving over information on basically Democratic members of the House Intelligence Committee, for investigations Department of Justice under President Trump. These kinds of things happen, which means Apple can go in and get that information. Facebook can get that information. There's already a methodology essentially in place right now where law enforcement can request this access, have a judge sign off, and get the information that they need. The problem, obviously, is not the Facebooks and the Apples of the world. It's those platforms that are end-to-end encrypted, like Signal is actually run by a nonprofit corporation, and they have drawn a line in the sand saying, no way in hell are we actually going to do that and break that encryption. And obviously, there's the issue for law enforcement. But the other thing that we have to think of society-wide is that most of the countries that let's say the United States and that we align with, Europe, Canada, Australia, et cetera, have privacy laws in place because the vast majority of the people in every country are not criminals. And if we're making laws that cater to the lowest common denominator, that's a huge problem. That's an issue. We have had various forms of privacy and secrecy technology going back for forever, whether it's simple codes on pieces of paper, back before computers, safes, all these kinds of things. And law enforcement has always had a tough time cracking codes or breaking into safes and all of this. And this is just the next evolution of this. But we also see that they continue to be on it. For example, I did another recent video / podcast talking about how the FBI, in conjunction with Australian law enforcement and Europol, are actually able to offer quote-unquote encrypted phones to criminal organizations around the world. And then obviously they had the encryption key, so they cracked and spied on all of this. So you can't say that law enforcement, including at the federal level, doesn't have the capability to essentially get around these things or request these things or find these criminals in a different way, knowing possibly that they're using this encrypted, end-to-end encrypted system. They may not necessarily be able to see the messages, but they might be able to intercept other things that are around that. So there's a lot that goes into this, and while I don't want to see any criminals be successful in their enterprise, no matter what they're doing, we also have to understand that most of us, you and me, are just not criminals. And so by virtue of that, why should our privacy be intruded by a government that could easily then get into a backdoor without a warrant, collect this information on us, and here we are. That's the problem that we have. And if the world is moving towards that level of authoritarianism, you're going to see basically smaller tech companies start catering to the privacy-minded people of the world, offering these things, and then they're going to come under fire from federal governments around the globe. So this is a very dangerous balance that we have to make here. Because obviously we want our law enforcement to be successful going against criminals, but we also don't want the governments to data mine us. Obviously, they already have a good chunk of information on you. If you're a registered citizen, you probably have a driver's license or maybe a passport. So they've got a lot of info on you, but that doesn't mean that they have the day-to-day information, who you talk to, what you associate with. Me having a driver's license doesn't tell them my political views, for example. And now they may have access to that. And that is of deep concern, especially if we're moving towards a more authoritarian stance worldwide, because quite frankly, if you're against the authoritarianism, then you're probably going to be lined up against the wall with everybody else. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online, and please stay private. Thanks, everyone.